There comes a moment when silence stops feeling peaceful and starts feeling like abandonment. When the spiritual books you've devoured become hollow echoes in your mind. When the meditation cushion feels cold beneath you. And when every teacher's voice sounds like it's coming from across an ocean you can no longer cross. This is not a failure of your practice. This is the moment your soul stops pretending it can be purchased, acquired, or achieved. You've been chasing something that was never meant to be caught. Like a child running after their own shadow, the faster you move toward enlightenment, the more it dances away from your grasp. But what if I told you that this very chase, this spiritual hunger that feels like it's consuming you, is actually the thing that's keeping you from what you seek? Carl Jung understood something profound about the human psyche that most spiritual traditions dare not speak aloud. The more desperately we reach for transcendence, the more we solidify the very ego we're trying to dissolve. Every spiritual achievement becomes another medal pinned to the chest of the seeker, another story the mind tells itself about its own progress. The enlightenment you're chasing is not a destination you'll arrive at. It's a trap your ego has set for itself, a beautiful spiritual prison built from the very materials of your own seeking. I end this moment. As you listen to these words, something inside you is already beginning to crack. Not breaking apart, but cracking open. Like a seed that must split for the tree to emerge, or like the dawn that must shatter the darkness to birth the light. There's an irreversible spiritual moment approaching, a threshold you can feel but cannot yet name. It's the moment when you stop being someone who seeks enlightenment and start being someone who realizes they were never separate from it in the first place. This is not another teaching to add to your collection. This is not another technique to master or another level to achieve. This is the recognition that arrives when the seeker finally turns around and sees that what they've been seeking has been walking behind them all along, patient as a shadow, constant as breath. The spiritual journey you thought you were on was never really about finding something you didn't have. It was about losing everything you thought you were. Every meditation session, every book, every teacher, every moment of seeking was preparing you for this one profound realization. The enlightenment you've been chasing is the very thing that's been doing the chasing. Jung called this process individuation, the psychological birth of the whole person. But what he understood, and what most spiritual seekers miss, is that individuation is not about becoming something new. It's about becoming what you've always been, beneath all the layers of seeking, beneath all the spiritual identities you've worn like costumes at a cosmic masquerade. The silence that once felt like abandonment? It's actually the sound of your true self, finally given permission to exist without having to prove its worth through spiritual achievement. The hollow echo of those spiritual books? It's the empty space where your authentic voice is learning to speak. The cold meditation cushion? It's the ground of being, no longer heated by the fever of your desperate seeking. This is the beginning of the end of your spiritual story. Not because you're giving up, but because you're finally ready to stop performing spirituality and start living it. The chase is over. The seeker is dying. What remains is something far more precious than enlightenment. The simple, radical ordinariness of being exactly who you are. You've spent years building a spiritual identity, haven't you? Layer upon layer of practices, beliefs, and experiences, each one carefully added to the person you thought you needed to become. The early morning meditator, the seeker of truth, the one who has read the sacred texts and can quote the mystics, the one who has transcended anger, or so you tell yourself, the one who has found peace, or so you perform for others. But Jung knew something about the human psyche that cuts through all spiritual pretense. We are not who we think we are. The person you've been trying to perfect through spiritual practice is not your true self. It's what Jung called the persona, the mask we wear to meet the world, the carefully constructed identity that tells a story about who we are. And now, in this moment of spiritual maturity, that mask is beginning to crack. The crumbling feels like dying because, in a way, it is. The false self you've been feeding with spiritual achievements is slowly starving. All those meditation hours, all those insights, all those moments of transcendent bliss, they were real, but they were also food for an identity that was never meant to last. The spiritual ego is perhaps the most seductive of all egos because it disguises itself as selflessness, as transcendence, as the very thing that's supposed to destroy ego itself. You begin to notice the subtle ways your spirituality has become performance. The way you sit just a little straighter when talking about your meditation practice. The way you collect spiritual experiences like trophies. The way you've learned to speak in the language of awakening, using words like presence and awareness and consciousness, as if they were magic spells that could protect you from the ordinary human messiness of being alive. Jung called the shadow the dark twin of our conscious identity. For the spiritual seeker, the shadow is not just anger or greed or lust. It's the part of us that's still desperately trying to achieve something through spirituality. It's the part that keeps score of our spiritual progress. It's the part that feels superior to those who haven't walked the path. It's the part that still believes enlightenment is something to be attained rather than something to be recognized. The shadow work of the spiritual seeker is uniquely challenging because it requires us to see through our own holiness, to recognize the ego hiding behind our most sacred practices. It's like discovering that the meditation hall you've been praying in is actually a hall of mirrors, each reflection showing you another angle of the self you've been trying to transcend. This is why Jung emphasized that the path to wholeness requires us to embrace what he called the coincidence of opposites. The spiritual seeker must learn to hold both the transcendent and the ordinary, the sacred and the profane, the light and the shadow. You cannot become whole by trying to be only light. You cannot find peace by banishing darkness. You cannot discover your true self by perfecting your false self. The crumbling of the false self feels like everything you've worked for is falling apart. Your meditation practice might feel empty. Your spiritual beliefs might feel hollow. The teachers you once revered might seem like echoes of your own projected fantasies. This is not a sign that you're failing on the spiritual path. This is a sign that you're finally ready to walk it authentically. There's a particular kind of loneliness that arrives in this phase of spiritual development. It's the loneliness of no longer being able to hide behind your spiritual identity. Your fellow seekers might not understand what you're going through because you can no longer speak their language of achievement and attainment. Your non-spiritual friends might not understand because you can't go back to the unconscious life you lived before you began seeking. This is the dark night of the soul that mystics speak of, but it's not the dramatic, poetic darkness of spiritual literature. It's the quiet, persistent darkness of no longer knowing who you are when you're not trying to be someone else. It's the darkness of discovering that beneath all your spiritual practices, you're still just a human being with human needs, human fears, human longings. But Jung understood that this darkness is not something to be transcended. It's something to be integrated. The shadow is not the enemy of enlightenment. It's the secret ingredient. The false self is not something to be destroyed. It's something to be seen through. The spiritual ego is not something to be eliminated. It's something to be recognized as just another story the mind tells itself. In this recognition, something profound begins to shift. The need to be spiritual starts to fade. The need to be enlightened starts to dissolve. What remains is something far more precious. The simple willingness to be exactly who you are in this moment, without the need to improve or transcend or achieve anything at all. There's a moment in every authentic spiritual journey when you realize you're standing at the edge of an invisible cliff. Behind you lies everything you've known about yourself, every spiritual achievement, every moment of transcendence, every identity you've carefully constructed. Ahead of you lies something that cannot be named, cannot be grasped, cannot be achieved. This is what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism that bridges the conscious and unconscious, the known and unknown, the self you think you are and the self you actually are. You can feel it in your body first. There's a subtle electricity in your chest, a sense that the ground beneath your feet is not as solid as you thought. Your normal spiritual practices might feel different, as if you're going through the motions of someone else's life. Meditation becomes less about achieving states and more about sitting with the profound mystery of existing at all. Prayer becomes less about asking for something and more about recognizing that you are already everything you could ever ask for. This is the threshold moment Jung spoke of when he described individuation as the central task of the second half of life. But it's not necessarily about age. It's about the psychological moment when you realize that all you're seeking has been preparing you for this one profound recognition. You are not separate from what you seek. You never were. The enlightenment you've been chasing is the very consciousness that's been doing the chasing. The symbols that appear in your dreams begin to change. Instead of ascending mountains or floating in light, You might find yourself walking through doors that lead to rooms that look exactly like the room you started in. You might dream of labyrinths that have no center, bridges that connect one side of yourself to another, mirrors that reflect not your face but your absence. These are not random images. They are the psyche's way of showing you that the spiritual journey is not about going somewhere else. It's about going deeper into where you already are. Jung understood that the self, capital S, the archetypal center of the psyche, is not something we achieve or attain. It's something we recognize. It's like realizing you've been standing in the ocean while desperately searching for water. The waves you felt, the salt you tasted, the vastness you sensed, it was all the ocean expressing itself through your individual experience of seeking. This recognition changes everything about how you relate to spiritual practice. You don't meditate to get somewhere. You meditate to recognize where you already are. You don't read spiritual texts to learn something new. You read them to remember what you've always known. You don't seek teachers to give you something you don't have. You seek them to reflect back to you what you've always been. But crossing this threshold is not without its challenges. There's a profound disorientation that comes with realizing you've been looking for yourself in all the wrong places. It's like waking up from a dream where you were desperately searching for your keys, only to discover they were in your pocket the entire time. The relief is mixed with a kind of cosmic embarrassment, a gentle humor at the beautiful absurdity of the whole seeking enterprise. The external validation you once received from spiritual communities might no longer feel nourishing. The praise for your deep insights, the recognition of your spiritual progress, the admiration for your dedication to practice, all of it begins to feel like applause for a performance you're no longer willing to give. This is not because you've become arrogant or superior. It's because you've discovered something that cannot be validated by anyone else, your own inherent wholeness. Jung called this the emergence of the authentic personality, the psychological birth of the individual who no longer needs to prove their worth through achievement or spiritual attainment. But this birth is also a kind of death. It's the death of the seeker, the death of the spiritual ego, the death of the one who thought they needed to become something other than what they already are. Standing at this threshold, you might feel a profound sense of aloneness. Not loneliness, but aloneness. The recognition that your spiritual journey is ultimately something you must walk alone. Not because you're isolated from others, but because you're finally connected to the source of connection itself. You realize that every teacher, every teaching, every practice was ultimately pointing you back to your own direct experience of being alive. This is the point of no return. Once you've seen through the illusion of spiritual seeking, you can't unsee it. Once you've recognized that enlightenment is not something to be achieved but something to be recognized, you can't unrecognize it. The threshold has been crossed. The seeker has been transformed. What remains is learning to live from this new understanding, to embody this recognition in the ordinary moments of daily life. The morning light looks different now, not because the sun has changed, but because the eyes that see it have been transformed. There's a quality of presence that suffuses ordinary moments, a depth of awareness that makes the simple act of breathing feel like a miracle. This is not the dramatic enlightenment of spiritual fantasies. This is the quiet revolution of recognizing that consciousness itself is the ground of all experience. You find yourself living from what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism that allows conscious and unconscious content to work together in creative harmony. It's like having access to an inner compass that always points toward truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable or challenges your previous understanding. The chatter of the mind hasn't stopped, but your relationship to it has fundamentally changed. Thoughts arise and pass like clouds across the sky of awareness. You no longer identify with them as my thoughts or feel compelled to believe them simply because they appear in your consciousness. There's a spaciousness that allows all mental content to be present without being invested in any of it as ultimate reality. This new frequency of living is characterized by what Jung called the reality of the psyche. You begin to understand that the inner world is not less real than the outer world, it's simply a different dimension of the same reality. Dreams carry as much weight as waking experiences. Intuitive insights are given the same respect as logical conclusions. The synchronicities that seemed magical before are now simply the natural way consciousness orchestrates meaning. Relationships begin to shift in profound ways. You're no longer trying to get anything from others' validation, understanding, energy, love. This doesn't make you cold or disconnected. Paradoxically, it makes you more available for genuine intimacy. When you're not trying to extract anything from others, you can simply be present with them in their full humanity, shadows and all. The need to share your spiritual insights diminishes dramatically. Not because you've become secretive or superior, but because you've discovered that the most profound truths cannot be communicated through words. They can only be lived, embodied, demonstrated through the quality of your presence. Your spiritual practice becomes less about doing and more about being. Time itself feels different. There's less urgency, less rushing toward some imagined future state of enlightenment. The present moment reveals itself as the only place where life actually exists. Past and future are recognized as mental constructs that exist only in the present moment of thinking about them. This is not a philosophical understanding but a lived reality that changes how you move through the world. Jung spoke of the individual who has integrated the contents of the unconscious as living with a doubled consciousness. You're simultaneously aware of the dreamlike nature of reality and fully engaged with the practical demands of daily life. You can balance your checkbook and contemplate the infinite mystery of existence without any sense of contradiction. The archetypes that Jung identified, the mother, the father, the wise old man, the anima and animus, are no longer abstract concepts but living energies that you can feel moving through your psyche. When you need compassion, you can connect with the mother archetype. When you need strength, you can access the father. When you need wisdom, you can consult the inner wise old man or woman. These are not separate entities but different facets of your own complete being. There's a profound ordinariness to this new way of being that might disappoint those who are still seeking extraordinary spiritual experiences. Enlightenment, you discover, is not about having cosmic experiences or supernatural abilities. It's about being fully present to whatever is happening in this moment, whether that's washing dishes, sitting in traffic, or listening to a friend's problems. The spiritual practices you once relied on might continue, but they're no longer driven by the need to achieve anything. Meditation becomes less about reaching particular states and more about resting in the awareness that's always present. Prayer becomes less about asking for things and more about recognizing the profound intimacy between the seeker and the sought. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the reality of the psyche and the importance of living from the self rather than the ego. The self is not something you develop or achieve. It's something you recognize as having always been the ground of your being. Living from this recognition doesn't make you perfect or eliminate human challenges. It simply provides an unshakable foundation from which to meet whatever life presents. The frequency you're now living from is characterized by what mystics call ordinary enlightenment. It's the recognition that the sacred is not separate from the ordinary, that consciousness is not separate from life, that enlightenment is not separate from this moment of reading these words. This is the ultimate paradox of the spiritual journey. The destination you were seeking was the very place you started from. The cost of this transformation is everything you thought you were. The reward is everything you actually are. This is not a poetic metaphor but a precise description of what Jung called the individuation process. You've traded the comfortable prison of spiritual seeking for the terrifying freedom of being authentically yourself. There's a profound grief that accompanies this recognition. It's the grief of realizing how much time you spent looking for something that was never lost. It's the grief of recognizing how much energy you invested in becoming someone you already were. It's the grief of seeing through the beautiful, elaborate spiritual story you told yourself about your journey toward enlightenment. But this grief is not a problem to be solved. It's a doorway to be walked through. Jung understood that authentic transformation requires us to mourn the death of who we thought we were. This mourning is not morbid or depressing. It's the natural psychological response to recognizing that the self you've been trying to improve or transcend was never the real you in the first place. The shadow work that began in the earlier stages of your journey now reveals its true purpose. It wasn't about eliminating your darkness or becoming a better person. It was about integrating all aspects of your being into a cohesive whole. The parts of yourself you rejected, the emotions you spiritual bypassed, the human needs you thought were obstacles to enlightenment, they were all essential pieces of your complete humanity. Jung spoke of the coincidence of opposites as the hallmark of psychological wholeness. You no longer need to choose between being spiritual and being human, between transcendence and embodiment, between light and shadow. You can be both simultaneously without contradiction. This is not about balance in the sense of equal portions. It's about wholeness in the sense of including everything. The integration process is ongoing. There's no final state of enlightenment where all inner work is complete. Instead, there's a continuous deepening into authenticity, a constant willingness to meet whatever arises in consciousness with presence and acceptance. This is what Jung meant when he said that individuation is not a goal but a process. Your relationship to suffering changes fundamentally, not because you no longer experience pain, but because you no longer resist it. Physical pain is still painful. Emotional pain is still difficult. But there's no longer a story about how these experiences shouldn't be happening or how they're obstacles to your spiritual development. They're simply part of the human experience, no more or less sacred than joy or peace. This acceptance doesn't make you passive or resigned. It makes you responsible. When you're not spending energy resisting what is, you have more energy available for responding skillfully to what's needed. Action arises from presence rather than reactivity. Decisions are made from clarity rather than compulsion. The inner freedom you've discovered is not freedom from life but freedom within life. You're free to be fully human without apologizing for your humanity. You're free to feel all emotions without being overwhelmed by them. You're free to engage with the world without being attached to outcomes. You're free to love without trying to possess. You're free to serve without needing recognition. This freedom is not achieved through effort or practice. It's recognized through surrender. Not the surrender of defeat, but the surrender of recognition. The recognition that you are already free, have always been free, and that all your spiritual seeking was simply the freedom exploring its own nature. Jung called this the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism that allows us to live from the self rather than the ego. It's not a technique to be learned, but a capacity to be recognized. It's always been available, waiting patiently for the seeker to stop seeking long enough to notice what's already present. The wisdom traditions speak of this as the pathless path, the goalless goal, the effort of no effort. It's the recognition that enlightenment is not something you achieve but something you are. It's not a state you enter but the very awareness in which all states arise and pass away. Living from this recognition doesn't make you special or superior. It makes you ordinary in the most extraordinary way. You're no longer trying to be someone else, no longer performing spirituality, no longer chasing enlightenment. You're simply being who you are, moment by moment, breath by breath, with no agenda other than showing up fully to whatever life presents. This is the ultimate teaching. There is nothing to achieve, nothing to attain, nothing to become. There is only this moment, this breath, this awareness that's reading these words right now. The enlightenment you've been seeking is the very consciousness that's been doing the seeking. The seeker and the sought are one. They always have been. The chase is over. The seeker has come home. What remains is the simple, radical act of being present to the mystery of existence, without needing to solve it, achieve it, or become it. This presence is not a practice. It's not a state. It's not an experience. It's the very ground of all practice, all states, all experiences. The more you chased enlightenment, the further you moved from recognizing that you are the enlightenment you seek. Now that the chase has ended, there's nowhere to go, nothing to achieve, no one to become. There's only this, the infinite mystery of being alive, aware, and free. If this recognition has touched something deep within you, if you've felt the truth of these words in your bones, if you've recognized yourself in this journey from seeking to being, then you've crossed the threshold. The old way of spiritual seeking is over. The new way of spiritual being has begun. And if you've truly crossed this threshold, if you've recognized that the seeker and the sought are one, if you've discovered that enlightenment is not something to be achieved but something to be recognized, then leave this in the comments. Silence is my sword. Awareness is my shield. Not because these are magic words, but because they point to a profound truth. In silence, the mind's seeking stops. In awareness, the heart's true nature is revealed. The sword of silence cuts through all spiritual pretense. The shield of awareness protects you from the illusion of separation. The journey is complete. The seeker has dissolved. What remains is the eternal, ever-present awareness that you are, that you have always been, that you will always be. This is not the end of the spiritual path. This is the beginning of authentic spiritual life.